Can you hear us? Is it working? Yes, good.
Wow, those lights are bright.
I know. I'm gonna have a sunburn. It's so bright.
Hope there are people out there. I can't really see.
No, we can't see anyone. There's no one in the room. There's no one there I can see.
Oh, we can just have a conversation.
Yeah, let's do it. So, it's been 30 years, right, for Prince of Persia?
Yes, this year is the 30th anniversary year of the original Apple II Prince of Persia. 30 years ago, I was at my Apple II trying to get to alpha.
So that's how it started? Did you start with games, or did you start to actually think about stuff before Prince of Persia?
Yeah, so it's funny, I was, yesterday after dinner, I was talking with Rami Ismail, and you know how, like, for young game devs now, like, they only see like the published successful games on our resumes, but I think like most of us, by the time Prince of Persia was published, I'd been making games for 10 years.
10 years.
Yeah, since I was in high school when I got my first Apple II computer in 1979, and started making games first in BASIC, then in assembly language. So I made a ton of games that were never published. I worked hard on them. I worked for a whole year on an Asteroids clone, trying to make it as much like the arcade version of Asteroids as possible. But about then, Atari told publishers that we couldn't do that, couldn't publish copies of their games. So that never got published. Then I spent a year, my first year in college, making a game called Death Bounce, which was like Asteroids, but just different enough that I thought, wouldn't get sued. So I sent it to Broderbund, my favorite publisher, and the Broderbund's founder, Doug Carlston, called me. This was actually my first real contact with the game industry. It was exciting. I was in college in my dorm room, and this is before the internet. So all these game makers and publishers are just like names I've seen in magazines or like on the title screen of a game.
Broderbund was a big one.
Yeah, Broderbund was.
Yeah, Will Wright and
Lode Runner. Yeah. So I got a phone call on my landline in my college dorm room, and it was Doug Carlston saying, "Hey, we got your game," which I had mailed to them on a floppy disk, and it's it's well programmed, but actually the game industry has moved on. This year the public likes a different kind of thing, and he sent me a copy of Choplifter. Anybody here remember have played Choplifter? Yeah. So this blew my mind. In 1982, it was the first game that I'd played that told a story. Because Asteroids, Space Invaders were all sort of, you have 3 lives, you have to get a high score. If you pass a certain number, you'll get an extra life. And all of that is based on the business model of like you're putting quarters into machines. But Choplifter told a story, and at the end it said the end. So that was sort of the inspiration for my next game, Karateka, and I worked on that for 2 years, which was it was a fighting game, a 2D side-scrolling fighting game, and but there was also a story. You were supposed to rescue the...
Yeah, it was a very different title. I remember when it came out, when Karateka showed up the first time, and you could feel that it was not like the regular basic fighting game that you could find at the time. There was basically like you were already starting to put story in your stuff, right? So
yeah, actually, I don't even know if there were basic fighting games at that time in 1984. There was Swashbuckler.
Yeah, I think Konami had a game called ER Kung Fu a very long time ago, and
yeah,
but
I
think
they came out about the same time.
Yeah, about the same time. But there was no all these guys came from the arcades, and there was no real story in the background of these titles. But Karateka had that feel.
Yeah, so Prince of Persia was my next project after Karateka. But by then, I sort of considered myself a veteran of the industry at age 21. Most of the stuff that I'd done hadn't been published, and I was also kind of torn between thinking, should I keep making games, or because I also loved movies. I loved I wanted to be a screenwriter. I wanted to do animated movies. I think if the Apple II hadn't come along when it did, if I'd been born 10 years earlier, I probably would have tried to be like a comic book artist or maybe a film director. That was kind of my dream. But what was so great about the Apple computer was that it actually put into my hands the power to make a game which was like an interactive story, creating kind of a fantasy in a world that people would actually hear about and play.
Yeah.
Because being at home.
Yeah, you could control the visuals and the story of what you were making.
And the industry was so young that there was not that much of a gap. It's like, Star Wars came out in and like when I tried to make my little Super 8 movie, obviously it was not as good as Star Wars. Like anybody could see that a kid had made it. But the games that I was making, in an assembly language and high res, there wasn't that much of a difference between my games and the published games, which at that time you could buy in like a Ziploc bag on a floppy disk in the local computer store. It felt like it was within reach.
Yeah, so the medium was not so advanced that you could actually put your title out there and not look like it's completely outdated. Actually, when Karateka and when Prince of Persia came out, they were, especially Prince of Persia, they were pretty breakthrough titles. Visually and story-wise, it was really a big shock. So then you got Prince of Persia published.
Yeah, right? Broderbund published Prince of Persia, and it's interesting because our subject today is kind of different media.
Yeah.
And games being one. And you could even say that games is many media, because today's AAA games, multiplayer games, mobile games are very different. Like they're really different art forms and different business models from those early games that we were selling on floppy disks. But after Prince of Persia shipped on the Apple II, I was thinking, okay, I've just spent 10 years of my life in front of the Apple II screen.
10 years.
Yeah, it's. And so I was like, I really want to try to pursue film. So I'd spent a year in between those two games, in between Karateka and Prince of Persia, writing my first screenplay. Didn't get made, almost got made, which was very, exciting for me at the time. But ultimately, it also sort of taught me a lesson, which is that a film takes so many people, and to make it, you need a producer, you need a studio, you need someone to put up the money. The great thing about Prince of Persia on the Apple II is that, if the movie that I'd written didn't seem to be happening, I could just go back and keep working on the game. I could push that forward all by myself, and that's still the case today.
Yeah.
Actually, in a way, it's even more the case because there's so many great tools now available. There's the internet. It's harder to make a game stand out now, out of the thousands of games that are released, but the tools to make something amazing are kind of in everyone's hands.
Yeah, it's never been easier to actually make games, right? So
in a sense, it's what's rare is like the real innovation, the leap forward, but it still happens. Yesterday we had Brendan Green talking about like he came up with PUBG, which is it's just like it was the idea. He didn't have incredible means at his disposal to create that.
Yeah, that was his point yesterday, right? I don't know if many of you were at the PUBG talk yesterday.
Minecraft a few years ago, of course, was another one like that. Just it's so there's still ideas out there waiting to be had to happen. And
so you were 25, I think, when you published Prince of Persia.
I was 25.
Yeah, you were 25, and then until the next one, there was 14 years, right? So during these 40 years, you went back to movies. You learned basically everything there was to know about movies. Or?
Well, see, at that time, movies were. The convergence that we talk about now had not yet happened. So making games was like on the Apple II, or by then the PC, on floppy disks. Online was starting to come in. Movies were like 16 millimeter film. You needed a camera, you need a film lab. You're actually cutting and splicing pieces of celluloid. So they were completely different crafts. So after Prince of Persia, I went, back to New York, where I'm from originally. I went to film school and spent a year learning how to shoot and edit 16 millimeter film and sound. I made some short student films, but the connection between the video games, it kind of wasn't there. Like the teachers at film school, like they would look at like Prince of Persia and be like, what is this? It's got, to me, like, you see, it's got cinematics, it's telling a story. And they'd be like, no, what we're doing here is film, like, listen to us. And likewise, while making games, what I was learning about like camera angles and so forth didn't really play into the games yet, because there were no camera angles.
Exactly.
In Prince of Persia, there's one camera angle. It's like
and there was no digital in the movie industry. It was George Lucas was actually starting to bring digital into movies slowly, but there was no link. So the movie guys, when they were looking at computers or video games, they had no idea what they were looking at, and didn't understand at all what was happening. Right?
Yeah, I remember that. Broderbund was actually not far from Lucasfilm in San Rafael, California, and I was, as a teenage Star Wars fan, who stood in line, to see Return of the Jedi on the first day in 1983. Like, the idea that I got to go visit the Skywalker Ranch was, amazing.
Yeah.
And I remember
we share that experience. So.
Yeah, you were there.
Yeah.
So Steve Arnold, who I guess he had on his wall a framed render. It was the first render I'd seen. I was making 280 by 192 pixel graphics, and then I look at what looks like a photograph of the road going up Lucas Valley Road going up to the Skywalker Ranch, and he's like, "That's not a photograph. That's a computer render." I'm like, what? They were doing something called ray tracing.
Yeah.
It was
so that was in the 80s. So Lucas was probably the only company that had basically its hands into digital graphics at the time already, and so that was the only link at the time between video games and the digital world of movies.
Yeah. So I got away from your original question, but so in those 14 years, I went to film school. I made some short films, and at the same time, there was the sequel to Prince of Persia, Prince of Persia 2: The Shadow and the Flame, and I actually kind of did that remotely. The team was at Broderbund in California. That was the year that I spent living in Paris. Because I wanted to travel. I learned Spanish, I learned French. I spent the summer shooting a short film in Havana, in Cuba. That was the year after the Soviet Union had kind of withdrew support. So Cuba was in economic crisis. I went down there with 16mm cameras, and shot film. Just trying to get out into the world, get out of the industrial park, out from behind the Apple II. But at the same time, in Paris, where we edited the short film, I had a PC, which blew out the electricity in the building. It took too much electricity.
It's a PC.
Yeah, it's like one. But on floppy disks, I edited the levels for the game and sent them by DHL to California. That's how we communicated.
Yeah, at the time.
Every few days, like a DHL packet would go back and forth with the team. So those two threads kind of came together when I founded a team called The Last Express in San Francisco. It was a game set on the Orient Express in 1914 on the eve of World War I, and it was a CD-ROM adventure game. And so to make it, we actually had to do a film shoot. We had a cast of actors and costumes, which we rotoscoped. I didn't mention rotoscoping, but that was kind of a tool to do the animation, first for Karateka and Prince of Persia, to make it more realistic filming.
Did you use it in Karateka?
Yeah, Karateka was Super 8. I filmed actually my karate teacher doing the punches and kicks, and then projected the frames and traced them on tracing paper. There's how to get those framed images into the Apple II is like, that's like
story.
It's like ancient history, probably beyond the scope of this discussion. But by the time of Prince of Persia, VHS had come in, so I was able to videotape my brother running and jumping and climbing and doing all the things. And then, again, sort of a painstaking process to digitize those frames. So for The Last Express, we actually created an automated digital rotoscoping process, which took the thousands of frames of the film shoot and turned them into something looking like pen and ink drawings. I was really inspired by comic books at the time, European comic books, Enki Bilal, François Skyton, Hugo Pratt, because I loved comics growing up, but they were American comics, totally different thing. And so when I came to France and saw like the kinds of adult stories that comic books could tell with these beautiful visuals, that was really inspiring. And so to me, The Last Express, part of the inspiration was to make a sort of an interactive pen and ink, fluid pen and ink animated comic.
So it was actually the first time before the big next breakthrough that movies and games actually merged for you, right? With
Well, it was the first time that I really felt like I was using like what I'd learned about screenwriting and filmmaking, directing actors, doing voice recording, camera angles, storytelling, like in the cinematics. felt like I was using what I'd learned in film in a game. But at the same time, a game is a completely different kind of storytelling. It's just, a film is a story where, like, you, as the filmmaker, as the editor, you control the time. You can create suspense and pacing, and you're sort of you're telling one story. In a game, it's like you're creating like a world that the player can sort of choose how to move through at their own pace.
So he controls, as you were mentioning before, like the player is controlling time, basically, like how much time he's going to spend in a room, for example, or somewhere in a game.
And of course that even more today in like in a multiplayer game, you can decide how long you want to hang out in a particular area, like seeing what's to be found, collecting loot, or you can just like go ahead and just like get into all the
Remember
combat
about yesterday the PUBG talk about pacing and how the bus is basically letting and the way the game is set lets people actually go into crazy moments and then slow down and then go back to crazy moments. So pacing, the ability to pace your
and that's what's so challenging really about storytelling in games, because whereas in film you control it, you can like work on it for a year and get the pacing just right. So it's like, it's a little boring in this part, let's make it a little shorter. In a game, you're actually kind of creating an engine that players can use any way they want. So they can break it. If you play in a certain way and you're bored, that's not the player's failure, that's the game designer's failure. You kind of want to create an engine that players will use to create sort of just by naturally playing, they will create their own stories. And the great thing about PUBG is that it's it works really well. Like the stories that naturally get created are thrilling. They've got that dramatic pacing with a lot of variety, so that it's actually worth at that point recording your game session and posting it,
on media,
sharing it, which is another new medium. I mean, in a way, it's a subset of film and TV. It's recordings of games that are played, but those are films that are made by players by using
sense of time. Let's talk more about time. So sense of time happens, right? So now it's actually a big AAA game with a AAA publisher like Ubisoft, and then you have Disney also.
Right.
So suddenly there's that convergence really happening where you've got a game and a movie going on, right? So how about that convergence? How was that?
You could say, that Sounds of Time, and I thought it was 2001 when I got together with Ubisoft, 2003 when the game shipped. Like for me, that was really the moment when sort of the two threads or three threads of my professional life kind of came together. It's and the first Prince of Persia, the 2D Prince of Persia, at that time was kind of like a dead franchise. I mean, it was like today there's like a resurgence of retro gaming. You can actually find and play the old games online. That wasn't so much the case in 2003 with the PlayStation 2 generation. So we were making a new game for gamers who hadn't played or didn't know about the first Prince of Persia. So,
but there was another visual breakthrough. I don't know if you remember, Sense of Time.
That's probably the one that most people here played, I'm guessing. Just how many played Sands of Time?
There's no one in the room. Don't ask. I can't see them.
If I do this,
no,
I can see. So it's. I mean, that was a great project. That was a great team in Montreal, and a young team too. And the challenge was really like, let's just sort of make a new game that's Prince of Persia, but just sort of set ourselves free to try to see like what would be fluid, kind of dynamic navigation like now, and because if you actually just transposed the Prince of Persia moveset to 3D as Broderbund tried to do with Prince of Persia 3D a couple years earlier, and actually the first Tomb Raider, the PS1 generation of Tomb Raider, actually sort of had the Prince of Persia moveset. You can step forward, you can run, you can jump. But just by itself in 3D, it somehow didn't have the fluidity of the 2D games where you can chain a lot of movements together and feel like feel that thrill of, I'm a character in an action movie. I feel like Indiana Jones in the first 10 minutes of Raiders of the Lost Ark. I'm jumping, I missed the ledge, I grabbed the web. So for Sands of Time, taking it into the vertical was kind of the breakthrough that made possible. The idea that you could run on walls and rebound. So yeah, that was a great project.
So then you worked with Disney also.
Yeah,
so that was a completely
out of
different
that,
beast.
Yeah, so I worked in Montreal with the Ubisoft team on the game, and then went back to Los Angeles and pitched the movie to Jerry Bruckheimer and to Disney. And so so the Prince of Persia movie was happening, and that was that was really when the time came full circle.
Yeah. So that was basically like when finally you were able to actually work on every media you're experimenting with. So you've always been sketching. So you've been sketching, you've been making games, and then you make a movie. So how do like games fit in storytelling across these different media? What's the difference?
The thing is, like, they're all really different. Like, each one of those things you just named is a different craft. It's and there's so many individual crafts now that go into making a game or a movie. Like I'm not an animator by the standards of today's animators. I'm not a programmer by today's programmers. I mean, all of those were just kind of means to an end. I was able to get good enough at all those individual crafts to make a game in 1989. Mm-hmm. But on a film, you multiply that by 10. It's like the person who makes the armor, that the Persian warriors are going to wear when they go into battle. That's like a lifetime of craft, of studying, like history and costume design, and how do you hand tool leather? How do you make weapons out of different materials?
It's all specialists in their domain, the best in their domain, basically.
Yeah. So to be on the set of the Prince of Persia movie, when it was shooting in Morocco, like with actual camels and horses and like hundreds of people in costumes, was and to think that this is what like making those little sprites on the Apple II had led to, was kind of overwhelming. And I actually didn't have much to do at that point. I had written the first version of the screenplay, I got the movie going, but by the time it was filming, I was the first of like 5 screenwriters that came after me. I mean,
wow.
Jerry Bruckheimer especially is known for having a lot of writers, work on it, and then so everybody on set has a job to do. It's like a well-oiled machine. They say, okay, we're moving, and like people are moving lights. They're herding the camels. They're closing up the tents. They're sending the trucks ahead to set up the next camp. I'm just the guy who made the game and wrote the first version of the screenplay. Why am I even there? So to keep busy on the set, I took my sketchbook, and I would just, sort of like the set photographer whose job was just to take pictures of the madness. I'd be like, my God, it looks like the Exodus. There's like hundreds of people going across that desert ledge.
Let's draw it.
Here's this Persian warrior, who's like taken off his helmet and he's sitting and he's like drinking water in the tent, next to all the TV screens. I'll sketch that. So sketching for me, it's kind of zen. It's a way to
it's a way to actually go back to your own like little creativity spot.
There's something
spot.
There's something about the scale of time on these projects is so different. Like if it's going to take a year to make, or in some sense 10 years, from start to the time that the public actually sees something. The great thing about a drawing is that you can do it in the time it takes to pick up your guitar and play a song. You can pick up your pen and do a sketch, and so the sketch is like a record of just those 3 minutes.
That's moment,
and it's.
There's a lot to say about the first time I met you. We were in France, and I was fishing by the river, and he was behind me, and he was drawing me fishing. So I saw that drawing not so long ago. It was kind of like touching. And the interesting thing about your drawings is that they are very much. We were talking about this a little bit before, which is like they are very pure drawings. It's not like noisy or complicated. It's all the purity of the lines, of the silhouettes of people, faces, and things like that. And we're talking about how it actually links to the purity. Like design is not about adding stuff. Good design is about removing, not adding. It's never about adding more and more crap. it's actually removing to go to the essence of what you're working on. And I found your drawings like very much like that.
It's interesting. I mean, often when I have more time to do a drawing, and the more time I can spend on it, kind of then the less, the more flaws I see in it. Because as it gets more realistic, then you can see, I didn't get the shading quite right. This is a little bit out of proportion, and that's where like the fact that I'm not a trained professional artist, kind of becomes more evident.
Yeah, and there's
but if it's just a few lines, it's kind of magical. Somehow our imagination fills in everything that's not there, and with a couple of lines, you can suggest something that communicates more than a more detailed drawing that I spent an hour making. And it's like that with games too.
It's like games, pure games, or writing, or comics, right? I mean, comics are the same way. You basically fill with your imagination a lot of the spaces.
In comics, you have all kinds of styles from, some of the most popular comics of all time, like Charlie Brown, Peanuts, or Mafalda, are really simple drawings, and yet they're universal. And then some very, very detailed, realistic comics, they're amazing too. But our imagination somehow enters into something that's very simple in a way that, like, the more lifelike it is.
So pixel art, it was not called pixel art at the time. It was just what we could do.
Yeah. But when you say, for example, that the animation in the original Prince of Persia or Karateka was fluid, it's because it's 8 frames a second. It's the character is 40 pixels high. Like, the player's imagination is bringing so much to it. But then if suddenly you say, okay, we have all of the pixels in the world and all of the sound effects, and we can make this look like a movie.
Yeah, photorealistic.
Then that's a different kind of challenge.
Yeah, completely.
Then you get the uncanny valley at points like, well, it almost looks like a movie, but there's something, I don't know.
That's the incredible choice that the last Zelda, I don't know who's played the latest version of Zelda, but they had that conversation for a very long time about the visual style of the game for these reasons, right? Like,
I loved the new Zelda. It's when you were talking about the GDC talk that the designers gave, which was where they showed all the different visual styles that they tried for Zelda before they arrived, and they had some more photorealistic ones, but they ended up coming back to this kind of cartoon cel-shaded one because in their words, it's an art style that lets you lie.
Yeah.
You shoot a deer with an arrow and it turns into a steak. It's like that's very different from like the Red Dead Redemption experience of like you got to skin the animal and there's like blood.
So if you wanted to actually leave room to weird stuff and non-photorealistic and not break that barrier, of photorealism, then you have to find a style that allows you to go through to communicate that, and that's where there is that link, that difficulty of choosing what you're going to do. Are you going to go fully realistic? Are you going to leave room for the imagination? All these kind of things. We see that in a lot of indie games, actually. So
yeah, finding the right visual style, the right language, is key.
Yeah, it's pretty.
When it's just right, as in Zelda, so many other things, become easier.
So another thing that has changed through that time period we've been working in the industry is the massively multiplayer games. The not so massively multiplayer games, but PUBG, Fortnite, all these games basically that let the player. You mentioned that we talked a little bit about this before, but let the player actually go and make his own story, unquote.
Or her own story.
Yeah. So, how does Prince of Persia fit into that, or storytelling in general? Like, what do you think about what's happening?
Yeah, games are, it's not just one medium. It's a whole, range of media, and new ones are actually being born all the time. So, a multiplayer game, it's not just there's the story of the universe. There's the story of, whatever story the designers kind of or lore they created for the world. Then there's this, and then there's like the stories of individual missions and characters that the designers created that players could discover. But more than that, there's the story of the player playing the game, and that, as with PUBG, the rules can be very simple, and yet the story, the player story, can be very powerful. So I think the success of games in which the players have more creative power to have unique experiences that no one has had before, and actually feel like by playing the game, you're creating something. That's hugely powerful.
Yeah,
and I think all the technology is, plus of course the mobile technology, the connecting millions of people together. It seems like that's the direction that we just naturally, as people, want to go. We want to share these experiences. We want.
Yeah, it's pretty. I mean, we actually even want to perpetuate, like keep the story going. We didn't talk about that before, but Pokemon Go is kind of like that. Everybody has a fond story about playing Pokemon in their youth, and then Pokemon Go arrives, and there's not even the fights or anything in there, but you still want to perpetuate that, right?
Yeah, the incredible stories about Pokemon Go are like, I was out at 3 o'clock in the morning, and these teenagers were following me. It was kind of a bad neighborhood, and a cop came over, and he was about to arrest them, and they were like, "No, we're looking for Pokemon." And he's like, "Oh,
me too."
And then they showed Pokemon to the cop, and so he was like, "Wow, here are these two people who would like normally one would be like arresting the other, and they'd be fighting, and they're actually united over this."
Over this game. Right? I was,
so to create a story, like a moment like that.
It's amazing, but it's basically like the story they lived that they were kids that they wanted to actually keep on going. When it came out, I was living in a village in south of France. There was no one there. It's completely at 6 p.m. Everybody's gone into their house or apartments, and there's no one. And when Pokemon Go came out, for a month, I could go outside at 10 p.m. and it felt like it was a village full of zombies, because everybody was walking around like that, and there were parents with their kids and kids running around, and it was dark, it was night, and you could only see the phones and the people walking around, and I had never seen anything like that. So the perpetuation of the impact of player story and the meta story of Pokemon just like kept on going, and there's a new version coming on top of that. So I don't know where we are at in time. Actually,
Yvonne is out there somewhere with a clock. I don't.
We still.
How much time do? Yeah.
We still have time. So
something you mentioned before that we touched on was the way that time functions differently in different media. So we talked about how players kind of control their own experience of time in a game. But it's interesting, even in what we call linear media, how differently time functions, and how so much of the craft revolves around that. I mean, in film, editing, pacing changes everything. I mean, you can have a longer cut of a film that actually feels like it goes by faster. There's not a dull moment, but it's actually 20 minutes longer than a shorter cut where you kind of start to feel bored. How can that be? It's just because the subtleties of how through sound, through choice of camera angle, editing, you control. That's sort of a big part of the art of filmmaking. It's really the art of editing. But then, and of course, TV. It's cinematic. It's sort of the same craft, except that you're telling a story. Instead of telling a complete story in the space of 2 hours, you're telling it over maybe 60 or 70 or 80 hours. It's a long form, and so there's just a whole different rhythm.
And there's that teaser at the end of the show all the time, right? It's like a Tintin. I don't know if you've read the comics Tintin, or if it's even called Tintin in Spain. Tintin.
Tintin, yeah, right. Must be. I mean,
so at the end of every
Tintin
double page, the last frame is about what's going to happen. You have to turn the page. The cliffhanger part, right?
So in that comics, is graphic novels is another form of storytelling, which is actually really different. And I found that out around the time of the Prince of Persia, Sands of Time, game, movie. That was the first time I actually wrote a graphic novel script, It was for a prequel, an anthology prequel to the movie, which Disney had the idea to do, and I volunteered to write it because I loved comics since I was a kid. As I mentioned, that's sort of probably what I would have kept on doing had I not sort of been the right age to get excited by the Apple II. So that was the first graphic novel script that I wrote, and I got to work with six great artists, and the idea was that each of them did a chapter. So that was part of the challenge, was to create like 6 stories within a story, kind of like the 1001 Nights, that would sort of justify the fact that each was in a different art style. But that was sort of the beginning of sort of my education in a new, completely different medium. And then the first really big one was Templar. It's a book I wrote about the Knights Templar in the 14th century. It's an swashbuckling adventure story with, and the illustrators, Lewin Pham and Alex Pouvillon, taught me a lot about how to tell a story on the page. And my first draft was a lot, because I was coming out of movie screenwriting. They were like, this could work in a movie, but actually in a graphic novel, it's like, and they would thumbnail it and storyboard it in a different way. And so I kind of started to get it. So that was like a whole other apprenticeship for me on how time doesn't work at all in the same way. Because you've got, for one thing, you've got a 2-page spread actually, and the reader sees it all at once. So all you can do as the artist is sort of guide, or like suggest to the reader how long to spend on a particular panel, because people read the words. It doesn't. You don't really guarantee that they're going to spend any time looking at the image that might have taken like a full day to draw with all this incredible detail. They could skim right over it. Other pages they might linger. The reader can turn back.
Yeah, and they have full control.
Yeah, and reading a book the second time is not the same as reading it the first time.
Right.
So you're actually, in a sense, it's almost like a game in that you're creating something that's going to be experienced by readers at their own pace, in their own way. But it's still linear. What you put on the page is going to be exactly the same every time. Yeah. But time is still critically important. The parts that you read fast versus the parts that you read slow.
I moved to the mobile industry, and it's interesting because time is actually of the essence in mobile games, because you can have games that can be experienced for 30 seconds. 3 minutes might be the amount of time all you have to play. So 30 seconds is when you don't know if the bus is going to come or not in time, or if someone's going to come. 3 minutes is when you know the bus is going to come. Then you have 30 minutes is when you have Wi-Fi and you're at home. And more than 30 minutes is really when you're like, you have nothing else to say. And then people are also playing while they are watching TV at the same time. So if there's a break or a boring part in a TV show, they will pull out their phone and start to look at something or play at something very, very quickly. So it's another completely different way to actually deal with time. It seems like we are always dealing with time.
And speaking of time, I'm kind of curious to see if you guys have any questions. How much time do we have?
It's 46, so we have 10, 15 minutes.
Okay.
So do you have questions? I don't know if there is a microphone where people can take your time.
Actually, before we take questions, I do have one announcement I want to make.
Oh, really?
It's a small announcement.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We mentioned it's the 30th anniversary of Prince of Persia.
Yes.
It's not a new game. Okay, it's not a new game or a new movie. It's
Why? Because
we're talking about different media. The thing about games and movies is that they take a lot of people and a lot of time, and
a lot of millions.
I'm just part of the picture. But no, it's a book. It's a book, and you don't even know what it is yet, but yeah, it's. So I kept a journal 30 years ago when I was making Prince of Persia on the Apple II. I didn't think I would ever publish it. I didn't think anybody but me would read it. But about a few years ago, I posted it online and released it, kind of self-published it as a Amazon book. and it's gotten it's gotten great response. And just by good timing, because I was sort of wishing that I had something to share in this 30th anniversary year of Prince of Persia, and Stripe Press called me and said, we'd like to reissue a hardcover collector's edition of the making of Prince of Persia, of the old journals. And in fact, the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, has my old collection of all of my old sketches and the original VHS tapes and the floppy disks and box art and just all the sort of the artifacts.
Yeah, that's
of,
pretty
of
amazing,
that
actually.
Old, yeah, I mean, it was really nice of them too. They came because, like most of us, I had a garage full of stuff that was taking up space. They kindly took like half of the contents of my garage and took it back to New York. So they're going to make those archives available. So we'll be able to do a illustrated edition of the old journals with kind of showing the work in progress.
Content and stuff people haven't seen before.
Oh yeah, this is stuff that even I haven't seen. It's there's like this is like the interim versions of Prince of Persia, like on one floppy disk that the next day I replaced it with another, but I stuck it in a shoebox. So yeah, the Internet Archive actually took those disks and they've got this amazing hardware that somehow copies the image even of a protected disk.
So they got the data out of the disks.
And so
from 30 years ago.
And so they're putting all of this online slowly. Yeah, I mean, not just Prince
CIA
of Persia,
stuff.
but like all games, all the old Apple II games. It's amazing now what they're starting to put up there that I can play games now that I haven't seen literally in 40 years. Like even games that 20 copies of were sold total ever. Like someone who had a copy of that has now put on. Anyway, but that's what the book is going to be, an illustrated collector's edition of the making of Prince of Persia journals. And so we're going to try to get it out, get to alpha by September, which is when Apple II Prince of Persia went alpha 30 years ago, and ship the book by the spring, which is spring 2020, which is when the PC version of Prince of Persia shipped. So that's the project. That's the little announcement.
Yeah, that's real game history. You have to definitely have to look at that. That's going to be pretty impressive. Are you going to have sketches in there? Or?
We're talking about it, and we'll see how how feature rich we have time to make it. But yeah, it would be fun to incorporate sketches into it. But we really want it to be like an authentic artifact of the past. Like not to go back and analyze and recreate history, but just to kind of. Because to me, part of what's interesting about the journals is that I was wrong, like almost all the time. I would say with confidence, "Yep, I'm going to be done in 3 months." Cut to 1 year later, "I'm going to be done in 3 months." and there's entries where I say, I better hurry up and finish this game because I don't even know if there's going to be a games business this time next year. This is in 1987.
Yeah, it's when it was actually collapsing, right?
So I think it's interesting to sort of see how, when we're in something, we don't have the same perspective that we have. Because, looking back, we tend to sort of edit our memories so that they make sense. And it's all part of a coherent story, like the one, we've just told, as if our lives make sense.
Yeah, exactly.
But in a journal, you're like, okay, when you're in it, you can't see it.
Yeah, it's a pretty important notion that when you look back, or when you look at things, you see the end result. And you don't see everything that has happened before. So even as you're watching presentations of AAA titles or anything like that, then there is everything that actually happened in the back. And since we're entertainers, we don't talk about it. We don't talk about the nightmares.
We can't. A lot of
the stuff that's happening.
A lot of it we can't talk about.
Yeah, we can't legally.
Again, when Rami and I last night, Rami tweeted this. He said, we should all publish our shadow resume, of all the projects that failed, the ones that never got published, that sucked, so that people could see this and people get a more realistic picture.
I would get killed by so many companies. That'd be scary. So many times.
Well, I mean, and we got tweets back. Some people said my shadow resume would look like this: NDA, 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 NDA.
Non-disclosure agreement. You're not supposed to talk.
Yeah.
So do you have questions?
Yes. Yes, in the front.
It doesn't work.
Okay, just talk loud. I'll repeat the question.
Hello?
Yeah, I messed up.
What's your advice for people who want to make games and somehow, someday, make this story or this thing one day has occurred in his mind, in its mind, and well, put it in a movie or a TV show, maybe.
So what's your advice?
Well, I think it's easier to make a game than to make a movie or a TV show. I mean, if you're an indie developer, if you have, use the tools at your disposal, make what you can make. Make the version of. I mean, you might imagine some huge AAA universe in great detail, but make the version of it that you can make. And you mentioned the TV show or movie. Write the script, write a spec script or a pilot describing this world, and just put it out there and see who responds.
You've spoken mostly about your fascination about time and its behavior in each media. Actually, Sands of Time was kind of an exploration about time behavior and time control. What would you do nowadays to keep exploring in this field, in the field of video games or in whatever other media?
NDA? No?
NDA.
I mean, every project kind of dictates its own. I mean, like the rewind in Sands of Time, which I guess you're talking about, was actually that was a response to a constraint. In an earlier, sort of more primitive version of the rewind in The Last Express, which also had a clock where you could, when you reached a dead end in the story, you could rewind a little bit or rewind a lot. I mean, sort of the reason for that was, our feeling that when you die and it says game over and the player has to restart, you've just kind of broken the continuity of the experience and it pulls you out of the world. So the rewind was a way to stay in the story longer, to stay immersed. Even though you'd made a mistake, you could keep playing. But after that, after Sands of Time, there's been a whole generation of indie games that use time, in all kinds of like brilliant and clever ways that are often. I think the best ones are really tied to the game itself. Like it makes sense for that game, but it wouldn't necessarily make sense, for another game. So as far as Prince of Persia, is concerned, I mean. Time has always sort of been a theme of the series. I mean, there was an hourglass in the original game, but again, that 60-minute timer. You have to save the princess within 60 minutes, or it's too late. That was kind of a way to deal with we don't want people to be able to play forever, but we also don't want to punish them by saying, okay, you've played for 20 minutes and now you have to start all over again from the beginning. It was, but time sort of. Plus the fact that time, timed puzzles, slicers and spikes and things like that, on the micro level is so key to that kind of, running, jumping action gameplay. Kind of made it a natural fit.
Hi, so here. My question is, now we're looking like a tendency of like having a very big renaissance of very classic and very popular PlayStation 2 games, like the God of War Renaissance. So is there any possibility that we can look forward to a Prince of Persia Renaissance?
I mean, I'm looking forward to it. As I said, I don't have anything to announce today, except the book. But yeah, I mean, I would love to replay those old games.
Well, it was like more like if you are interested in doing another look at Prince of Persia.
If I'm in, yes.
Another question? Yeah.
So, you've been writer for the Prince of Persia video games, the movie, even the graphic novels. Which one would you say was the most challenging thing trying to adapt the Prince story to every single media?
I mean, the movie screenplay was a challenge because that was the one time it was a direct adaptation. That is, for Sands of Time, the game, it wasn't adapting the story of the original Prince of Persia. It was actually creating a new story that was custom tailored to that game, that team, like the rewind, the parkour, we knew that was the gameplay. So then it was a matter of coming up with a story that would, put that gameplay in the best possible relief, that would highlight its strengths and kind of minimize its weaknesses. The fact that the story of the Sands of Time game takes place in a destroyed palace, where all the other characters except for the prince and Farah are sand monsters, that was a choice because, our engine can't do crowds of living, breathing, interacting, people the way that, you can in the modern generation. So it was kind of convenient that everybody you ran into was a sand monster who was trying to kill you. And the fact that the palace was destroyed worked well because, what's the point of being able to do parkour and run on walls if you can just take the stairs? So if the staircase has been destroyed by an earthquake, suddenly you have to find a creative way to get up that broken flight of stairs. So that was, in that case, the storytelling was a pleasure. It was easy because, let's find the story that works best with the game. So adapting that into a movie was, I guess, a challenge because it's, okay, so if this is going to be a Disney Jerry Bruckheimer summer movie, it's not going to be a story about two people going through a destroyed palace. That would be Resident Evil was a horror movie. That worked fine, but we weren't making a small, low-budget horror movie. We were making this, what had to be this giant thing. So, okay, it's got to have ancient Persia. It's got to have, we're going to have caravans. We're going to have armies. We want all of that stuff. So, okay, how can we come up with a story that takes advantage of what movies can do, and especially of what Jerry Bruckheimer can do, which we didn't have in the game, but somehow still tell the story of the game in such a way that we'll feel, okay, it's still somehow Prince of Persia, and it's still somehow Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. So we've got a dagger that can turn back time, but what could be more undramatic in a movie than a hero who goes through the movie, and anytime something happens, that's bad, he can just press a button and undo it. That might be real. It's nice to have in a game, but in a movie, you can only do so much of that. So changing the rules of the dagger so that it's only got a very limited amount of sand, and kind of adding a journey aspect to the story. Again, the movie evolved a lot from the first screenplay that I wrote, which you can read online on my website if you're interested. But it still kept the same basic structure of the story, so to answer your question, yeah, adapting a game story as a linear 2-hour movie story was a challenge.
So the constraints are not the same, basically. From the game engine constraints and matching the story to that, and then the movie constraints are completely different. So you basically have to adapt to the media.
Different constraints and also different opportunities.
Yeah.
Because you can do something with this. You don't just want to do something within the constraints. You want to do something that's going to be awesome in some way that only that medium can be awesome.
Can give you.
Hi, how are you? Right here. Here.
Yes.
So I was just wondering, when you worked on Prince of Persia, you did it all by yourselves. You did what you wanted to do, and you didn't have any creative constraints on it. And now, at this time, if you want to develop a new game, whatever, maybe a Prince of Persia, you need to work with a ton of people, other creators, directors, I don't know, marketing, whatever.
And a ton of money.
Yeah, and a ton of money. Yeah, so it's a whole different world now, the game development, even for indies, than at that time. And how you feel about it, and you like or you prefer that long gone era of developing whatever you want in the terms you wanted, or these new big productions that people want, maybe?
Yeah, it's a trade-off. I mean, making a AAA game or a big movie is thrilling. I mean, it's like the huge circus. It's great. I mean, I feel really lucky to have experienced that, and also the creative collaboration with so many people who bring a lifetime of experience to their crafts it's amazing. So I would never want to give that up. But just to stay sane, it's like in the midst of these projects that take years and are sort of out of my control in important ways, and don't, the way they turn out involves, a lot of compromise with reality. It's it's refreshing to be able to do, for example, a graphic novel, which is a collaboration, between, as on Templar, I was the scriptwriter, worked with a husband and wife team of artists, and a colorist and an editor. So, like, that's a team that's small enough to fit around like one table in a cafe, and we worked together for 4 years. So that's very intimate. And to be able to do that sort of at the time that the movie and these other things was happening, I could be like, okay, what happened today on the movie was crazy, and there's nothing I can do about it, but let's work on this, this chapter of the book. And then, of course, sketching is like probably the most solitary and intimate, because I don't even talk to anybody. I just do it, like, I do it myself, and nobody even knows it. So that's, I think the balance of having all of those, obviously for each of us, depending on our personality, you got to find the right balance. Some people just love that craziness of, like, being in a studio, running a studio, having, everybody, like, wanting your attention constantly, and like, they thrive on that. For me, like, a little bit of that, personally, I'm happiest if I can kind of balance that with some quiet time, writing time, sketching time, and just the smaller projects.
And you miss the hands-on on the project also.
Yeah.
Because on the big projects, you probably will not be able to go deeper in detail on how things are done.
Well, you have your hands on different things at different time. As the creative director of a big game, you have your hands on mostly on PowerPoints and on what you say to people, in meetings. It's rare that you don't get to sit down and code. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you get to sit down and actually write a vision, document or a little story. But if you're the screenwriter, you get to write every word. You have your hands on the script, but then you hand that script to someone who is, you didn't make the movie, you made a script. You made a draft.
Just a quick point on what you were saying. When you know the Apple II hardware, right? Yeah. So it's not letting you do what you want to do. The constraints are pretty insane. So you basically had to work with these constraints. They are different. But
it's like I'm making the Apple II Prince of Persia. It's like, okay, I'm going to spend this week, making a graphics routine to blast sprites to the screen a little faster than the routine that I wrote last month. It's like,
that's what you have to do. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think it's time for a rest for everyone. Thank you very much, Jordan and Fred, for helping us through.
Thank you.